There's just a couple more quick notes I want to give you on interfaces, and then we're going to write up a couple more quick examples with interfaces to just get a better sense of how they work. So let's go through these last couple notes. All right, so first off, interfaces are not generic types. So if you're coming from, say, C# or Java, which have access to generic types, interfaces are not a full-on replacement for them. So we can't use interfaces to write completely generic code or code that accepts absolutely any kind of type and then just kind of deals with it appropriately. Go actually, somewhat famously, does not have support for generic types. And so it's best not to think of interfaces as being a replacement for them. They're just a tool that we have to sometimes write code that is a little bit more concise or doesn't repeat itself quite as much as it might otherwise. Now, if you're not familiar with generic types, that's really totally fine. Don't worry about it. I just want to throw that in there as a very quick aside. Now, the next thing I want to tell you is that interfaces are what we call implicit. So inside of our code snippet that we put together over here, you'll notice that at no point in time did we ever have to say, oh, English bot and Spanish bot. Just so you know, you are also of type bot because you satisfy this interface. All we did was declare this interface and the different functions that it expects to see. And then Go essentially took it from there. So you and I never put together any type of manual code to somehow link together bot and English bot and Spanish bot. Go takes care of all the matching for us. And so because Go takes care of it for us, we say that interfaces are implicit. So we did not have to explicitly define any link between these different types here. Now that's both a blessing and a curse, personally. I think that it's really nice that we don't have to write out some more boilerplate to say something like type English bot implements bot or something like that. You know, we don't have to do anything like that in Go, which is kind of nice. But on the flip side, it makes figuring out what types of yours implement other interfaces a little bit challenging because you kind of have to flip between the interface definition and your custom type and say, okay, I need to make get greeting and it has to return a string. And then you go down here and you start working on your function. And then you say, oh, oops, I returned an int and it needs to be a string. And you don't necessarily get a lot of quick feedback on exactly how to implement that interface until you start to see some error messages pop up when you compile your code. So this whole interfaces implicit thing, kind of both a blessing and a curse, because it saves us from some boilerplate, but also sometimes makes it a little bit hard to keep track of which types implement which interfaces. Now, next point, interfaces are a contract to help us manage types. And this is an extremely important note, something that I really want to point out here. I've seen a lot of people look at interfaces and they think, oh, interfaces are like some type of built-in test for my code, or they're just going to make sure that my code always works correctly. And you really do not want to think of interfaces in such fashion. Over here on the right-hand side, notice the note that I added on. I said, garbage in equals garbage out. So if you are implementing some function to match get greeting right here, and you return some, maybe you return a value of type string, but it's like just a garbage value or a garbage string, hey, Go's gonna think that you're still implementing get greeting right here, but your program might crash later on, or it might not do exactly what you expect. In other words, let's look at a very practical example of this. So when we define get greeting for both Spanish bot and English bot right here, you and I know very well that, okay, this needs to return a type of greeting. But if we instead decide to return something like, this right here, well, hey, it's still of type string. It doesn't really probably work for what we're trying to do. Like we want to return a greeting, something like hi there or hello or how are you doing from this function. But all Go cares about is making sure that you returned the correct type. So interfaces are about helping you reuse code or kind of form a contract between different functions and different types, and they're not necessarily going to make sure that you don't make some otherwise basic logic mistake inside of your code. And we'll see some really good examples of that when we start looking at interfaces inside of the standard library. I'm going to point out some examples, and we're even going to write out an example or two where, yeah, hey, interface is going to help us, but it's not necessarily going to keep us from making some big mistake in our actual logic inside of our code base. Okay, now last note here, really important note for you as someone who is learning Go. Remember, interfaces are tough, really tough. Now, step number one in figuring out how interfaces work and what they're doing for us is just understanding what interfaces do and how to read the official standard library documentation and understand the different interfaces that are defined in there. So just understanding, just like kind of reading interfaces is step number one in this difficulty curve. So do not worry from the get-go about writing your own interfaces and making use of them inside of your own application. Like I'll tell you right now, you can write entire just lines and thousands of lines of code of Go code in your own custom program in your own personal projects without worrying about writing your own interfaces. So interfaces are not a requirement of the language. You don't have to create your own. Of course, it's highly recommended that you do at some points for code quality and clarity and all that kind of good stuff, but you are not necessarily required to use them or to write your own interfaces. So step one in the difficulty curve, like step one in just getting used to interfaces, is being able to understand the standard library documentation and understand what the standard library documentation means when it says, oh yeah, I expect something of type blah, 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 and then that type ends up being an interface. And so that's what we're going to focus on here for number one, is just how to look at the standard library documentation and understand the use of interfaces in there. Now, much later on, as you start to gather more experience around interfaces, well, then at some point in the future, okay, then at that point, once you feel more established, once you've got a lot more practice, then come back and start thinking about, hey, how am I going to write my own custom interfaces for my own application? So do not worry about using them on your own on day number one. Okay, so I think that's enough on some of the background around interfaces. So we still need a lot of practice with them. So let's take a quick break. We're going to come back in the next section and we'll get some more practice around putting together some interfaces and how we interpret them and all that kind of good stuff. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.